In 1942, in Tobruk, North Africa, a small group of Wehrmacht mechanics observed something unusual. A captured American Willys MB Jeep still running after days of combat. When they opened the hood, the shock didn't come from the power, just 60 horsepower from the Go Devil engine, but from the logic. Everything there was simple, colorful, readable. A vehicle designed to be repaired by any soldier, not by engineers. The air seemed to vibrate. The heat shimmered over the desert like a living lens. Grains of sand stuck to the sweat and burned like red-hot iron. In the distance, the rumble of an engine died in gasps, the sound of a metallic prisoner. The German convoy stopped, and on the trailer, wrapped in dust and enemy glory, came an almost intact Willys MB Jeep. The mobile symbol of modern warfare had just fallen into the hands of the Reich. Hans Keller, a 36-year-old Wehrmacht engineer, wiped his face with a grease-stained handkerchief. The sun gilded his helmet and made the metal shine like a bronze cap. "Another American toy," he muttered. Behind him, the mechanics formed a circle of curiosity and disdain. The enemy was there, of steel and rubber, and it seemed ridiculously simple. The main workshop tent rose a few meters away. The canvas snapped in the hot wind. Inside it, the smell of burned oil and new metal created a dense, almost religious atmosphere. Otto Reinhardt, the team leader, watched in silence, his mustache twitching with impatience. "We are dismantling this today. I want to know what these idiots call a war machine." At 5:05 p.m., the Jeep was placed in the center of the tent. 4 lanterns surrounded it, casting shadows that seemed like giants. The hood, dented by a stray bullet, still bore marks of sand and salt. The olive-green paint was scratched by shots and time, but it was there, whole. Weight, 1,040 kilograms. Engine, 134 cu. Power, 60 HP. Drive, full 4x4. Top speed, 105 kilometers per hour. Hans noted it all, almost automatically. The sound of the pencil scratching the paper was like a dry shot. Fritz Adler, the youngest apprentice, couldn't hide his fascination. "Herr Keller, they painted the wires different colors," he exclaimed, pointing to the engine compartment. Hans frowned. It was true. Red, blue, and yellow wires, each one labeled, each one with a clear path. It was an insult to German complexity, and at the same time, a screaming lesson. Underlying thesis: American genius lay in the obvious. Industrial logic trumping tactical brilliance. The Go Devil engine coughed twice before waking. A deep, direct sound without frills. Controlled vibration without the elegant purr of a Maybach, but without pauses. "Ugly to hear, good to trust," Fritz muttered. Hans pretended not to hear. The Jeep breathed hot air and returned cold confidence. No complicated valves, no millimeter precision adjustments. It was crude, obedient, and, the most painful to admit, functional. While Otto made brusque notes, Hans examined the details. Standardized screws, all the same type. Simple plates without hidden rivets. Hoses with identical clamps. Everything made to be swapped quickly, without thinking. "Our Kübelwagen needs 10 specific tools to change the filter," Hans murmured. "Here, 2 suffice." Otto glanced at him sideways. "They design for idiots, Keller. We design for soldiers." Hans replied only with a look, divided between irony and respect. The sun was setting. The light pierced the tent canvas and tinged everything gold. The Jeep reflected the glow, as if laughing. Outside, the wind brought the distant smell of fuel and despair. The mechanics dispersed, and silence settled in. Hans remained. He ran his finger over the hot hood, feeling the metal as if it were skin. The texture said it all. Made to last, not to dazzle. He opened the notebook and wrote a single line. "The enemy manufactures as it thinks, fast, equal, infallible." The clock read 7:12 p.m. when he closed the hood. Outside, the desert was cold and blue. Hans looked at the Jeep one last time before extinguishing the lantern. In his eyes, the first spark of something he didn't yet know how to name, admiring the enemy. That day in Tobruk, the Reich captured more than a vehicle. It captured a mirror, but it didn't know how to recognize its own reflection. The sun rose, tearing the horizon like a golden blade. The wind blew dry, carrying grains of sand that buzzed against the steel plates of the vehicles. Inside the workshop, the heat already rippled in the air, and the smell of burned oil mixed with the instant coffee of the soldiers. The Willys MB Jeep, still covered in dust, rested like a patient in the surgical center. Hans Keller adjusted his wristwatch and began the disassembly. "We start with the base, as always," he murmured. The clock read 7:45 a.m. Otto Reinhardt watched in silence, arms crossed, expression of a general in judgment. Fritz Adler, the young one, noted everything in a small notebook, his eyes shining with anxiety. The sound of tools echoed rhythmically. Clicks, snaps, metallic sighs. Each turn of the wrench was a note in a symphony of steel. The hood was raised. Beneath it, the Go Devil engine displayed itself with disarming clarity. 4 cylinders in line, 2.2 liters, compression ratio 6.48 to 1, 60 horsepower at 4,000 RPM. Fritz read the inscriptions like a psalm. Hans, accustomed to Germanic perfection, felt the first technical discomfort. Everything was too easy. "There's nothing hidden here," he said in an almost accusatory tone. Otto replied dryly, "Not everything simple is worthy." The air filter came loose in 2 seconds. No special wrench, no complicated fitting. The colored wires guided the hands as if the vehicle spoke to the operator. Red for ignition, blue for headlights, yellow for instruments. Everything labeled, everything uniform. Hans stood still for a moment. That color code was childish and genius. "They designed it for someone who's never seen an engine in their life," he said. Fritz replied without hesitation, "And that's why they win, Herr Keller." At 8:10 a.m., the Jeep came back to life. The engine roared with a deep, direct sound without frills. The ammeter needle rose, the vibration stabilized, and the sound turned to pulsation. Otto frowned. "Ugly but reliable," he commented. Hans didn't respond. He saw, for the first time, a machine made not for admirers, but for survivors. Underlying thesis, American logic replaced pride with productivity. While Fritz measured the radiator water temperature, 85 degrees Celsius, in 4 minutes, stable, Hans examined the screws, all identical, all interchangeable. With this, any soldier can repair it alone, in the field, without a manual. "Any soldier," Otto repeated, biting the words. The silence that followed was heavy as wet sand. The Jeep trembled in place, obedient and stubborn. Hans touched the engine with his fingertips, felt the heat, the rhythm, the crude balance, and recognized something his training rejected, the beauty of practicality. The Kübelwagen, in comparison, was an orchestra, light, efficient, elegant, but made for musicians, not soldiers. The Willys, no. The Willys was an infantry march, made for noise, for error, for improvisation. At 8:47 a.m., Hans closed the notebook. 2 columns were written at the top of the page: perfection, fine lines, custom parts, tight fits; service, easy access, standardization, robustness. The second column was growing. The pencil scratched the paper with contained anger. Otto noticed and said, "They have quantity, we have quality." Hans raised his tired, gray eyes. "And when war demands millions, Otto, what is more deadly, the number or the refinement?" The old mechanic looked away. At the back of the tent, the Jeep kept running, the constant rumble almost mocking. Outside, the wind picked up. Flags fluttered over the dunes, mixing dust and pride. With each gust, the torn swastika fabric snapped like cracking steel. Hans looked at the vehicle one last time, like someone observing an inconvenient truth. "They manufacture as they breathe," he thought. "We manufacture as we pray." That dawn in El Alamein, the Wehrmacht discovered something no weapon could stop. American engineering didn't need glory, just to work. The sun slanted over the desert, tinting everything copper. The heat made the air ripple over the metal, creating mirages in tired eyes. Hans Keller was still under the Jeep, lying on a sand and sweat-covered tarp.
The distant sound of shots on the front was just a reminder. Time was running, even in the workshop's silence. The Willys Jeep was almost fully disassembled, and each part seemed to hide a provocation. The transmission, compact and direct, seemed primitive but perfect in purpose. 3 simple gears, 1 robust low gear without refinement. The differential, heavy and straightforward, prioritized torque over comfort. The brutal simplicity translated to pure efficiency. Total gearbox weight, 32 kilos. Field swap, 15 minutes, Fritz noted, his voice trembling. Hans observed the young man with curiosity and a certain discomfort. "You speak of it like you're praising the enemy," Fritz replied without hesitation. "It's not praise, it's observation." Deep down, Hans felt the same, but he couldn't admit it. To him, the Jeep was a mechanical heresy, without polish, without aesthetic harmony, without the German spirit. Still, the more he disassembled, the more he saw logic where he once saw carelessness. The engine had larger clearances than the German standard, and that's why it didn't seize under dust. The carburetor accepted bad gasoline without complaint. The leaf spring suspension took hits like a battle-hardened soldier. Everything there screamed, "Work, even if it hurts." Otto entered the tent, sweating and irritated. "Enough idolatry. Make your report, Keller. Command wants to know if this junk is worth studying." Hans stood up, wiping his hands on the rag. "Junk that doesn't break, Otto. You know what impresses me most? Identical screws. All of them, from the radiator to the oil cap." "That's industrial stupidity," Otto exploded. "Each part must have the exact measure for its function." Hans smiled, tired. "And that's why they make 10,000 a week, and we 10,000 in a year." Otto's voice trembled. "We have pride." Hans replied softly, "And they have victory." Silence. Just the wind slapping the canvases and the buzz of a fly over the hood. At 6:10 p.m., the sun set, and the desert plunged into a reddish twilight. Hans picked up the notebook and wrote a short, almost confessional phrase. "They don't design for engineers. They design for tired, dirty men in a hurry." Outside, Fritz lit a lamp and observed the Jeep under the golden light. The metal seemed to breathe. The young man said in a low voice, "You know what's funny, Herr Keller? It seems like the Jeep was made to survive the war. We, maybe not." Hans didn't respond. He just looked at the vehicle and understood for the first time that there was something the Reich could never replicate: humility in machine form. While Germany polished diamonds, the United States forged stones, and on the battlefield, the stones won. The red flag fluttered lazily over the camp. The wind brought the smell of burned oil and stale bread. Otto Reinhardt walked in short, hard steps, his face contracted in a mask of irritation. In his hand, Hans's partial report. The pages were covered with meticulous notes, but one phrase enraged him. "American engineering philosophy prioritizes functionality over aesthetics." To Otto, that sounded like heresy. Hans waited for him inside the tent with the Jeep behind him, now partially reassembled, like a trophy in reconstruction. The hood was open and the engine clean. The metallic sound of the wind hitting the awning seemed the prelude to an inevitable discussion. "Explain yourself," Otto said dryly. Hans looked at the vehicle and replied without turning his face. "They think of the soldier, not the engineer. It's a philosophical difference, not technical." "Philosophy, this is war, Keller, and war is precision."
Hans breathed deeply. No, war is repetition. It's quick replacement, simple repair, back to the fight. The Jeep is made for that. Otto approached. The smell of cigarette and grease mixed with the hot air. "You want to convince me that simplicity is superior to perfection?" Hans raised his eyes. "In total war, yes, because perfection dies with the first mechanic." The tension was palpable. Fritz, in the background, pretended to fiddle with tools just to escape Otto's gaze. The silence was broken only by the snap of the metal cooling in the engine. "This report won't leave here as is," Otto said,
tearing the last page. High command wants numbers, not cheap philosophy. Hans said nothing. He picked up the torn piece, pocketed it, and replied calmly, "Then that's what we'll lose. Not for lack of courage, but for lack of humility." At 9:57 a.m., Otto left the tent. Hans stayed alone with the Jeep, observing the reflection of light on the simple curves of the bodywork. In his head, a thesis was born like a revelation. The Americans would win because they accepted imperfection as a system. Germany, on the other hand, remained prisoner to the idea of purity, even in mechanics. In Hans's diary, another phrase, written with firm strokes: "Perfection is the luxury of those who don't fight for survival." Outside, planes crossed the sky in formation. The roar of Allied engines sounded distant but constant, like a reminder of a future approaching with industrial cadence. While Germany wrote engineering treatises, the Americans wrote instruction manuals and taught the world to win. The dawn of September 17th brought a cutting wind, raising whirlwinds of sand that seemed to blow from hell itself. The improvised test field stretched a few kilometers from the front line, with the horizon shimmering under 40 degrees of heat. Two vehicles were lined up, an impeccable Kübelwagen and the Willys MB Jeep, still stained with American dust. Hans Keller, Otto Reinhardt, and Fritz Adler watched his soldiers gathered around, eager to see the clash of ideologies on wheels. The air was heavy with expectation and pride. The Kübelwagen went first, light and elegant, crossing the firm ground with Germanic precision. But just 100 meters of soft sand were enough for the engine to start groaning. The 4x2 sank slowly, the rear wheels spinning uselessly, raising clouds of pointless dust. Otto shouted orders, frustrated, while men pushed the car with effort. Hans watched in silence, his sweaty hand on the notebook, his gaze fixed on the scene. Technical perfection choked on the chaos of reality. Then, Hans climbed into the Jeep. The Go Devil engine responded with a firm, deep roar. He shifted into low gear with a single motion and advanced. The wheels bit into the sand with force. The 4x4 tore through the desert as if born from it. The vehicle didn't race. It walked with purpose, conquering sections where the rivals surrendered. In less than 3 minutes, it reached the finish flag. The silence after the test was so dense that the wind dragging dust over the hot metal could be heard. Hans turned off the engine and got down. Otto looked at him with a mix of anger and disbelief. Fritz, panting, recorded everything: fuel consumption, average speed, and maximum torque. The data spoke for itself. The Jeep, crude and simple, outperformed the Kübelwagen in traction, durability, and adaptation. Hans wrote in his report, "Simplicity is the highest form of efficiency." When he finished writing, he noticed something new in the looks around him: respect, but also fear. The desert had just proven what the Reich didn't want to hear. The next morning, Hans remained in the communications tent, reviewing his report with almost religious attention. The pages were covered in numbers and observations: weight, torque, maintenance, average component swap time. Each datum was a technical confession. "This vehicle represents the superiority of pragmatic American engineering," he wrote. Fritz watched in silence, while Otto, outside, smoked with growing nervousness. The truth weighed like lead on those sheets. At 10:45 a.m., the report was delivered to Captain Vogel, who read it in a low voice, frowning. "This won't be well received in Berlin, Keller," he said, in the tone of one who warns and threatens at once. Hans replied, "Then it's better that it's understood here." Otto burst in abruptly, snatched the sheets, and tore the last page, throwing the pieces on the table. "You're shaming German engineering," he shouted. Hans stared at him coldly. "No, I'm saving it from its own pride." Hours later, the corrected report departed for high command, rewritten under Otto's supervision. In it, the Jeep was described as useful but inferior in refinement, and the Kübelwagen as superior in design and reliability. Hans watched the messenger carry the sealed envelope and felt the weight of the lie receding into the desert dust. Fritz approached and whispered, "I kept a copy." Hans replied simply, "Then the truth still has an engine." That night, the wind brought the distant smell of rain and gunpowder. Hans remained in the workshop, observing the Jeep under the flickering lantern light. The vehicle seemed to breathe, indifferent to politics, vanity, and censorship. He touched the cold metal and thought of how many men that simple design would still save. In his notebook, he wrote the day's last words. "When truth is censored, the machine becomes witness." And he closed the notebook slowly, like sealing a secret. The sun was already high when Captain Vogel arrived at the camp, his uniform impeccable against the dust and grease. He brought the cold authority of men who speak little and decide much. In the main tent, Hans Keller awaited him, with the Jeep in the background and the firm gaze of one who had no more doubts, only consequences. Fritz watched from the side, sensing that this meeting would be another battle, not of tanks, but of principles. The silent engine in the background seemed to witness every breath. Vogel began without preliminaries. "Your report caused discomfort in Berlin. The word used was subversive." Hans kept his gaze fixed, his voice controlled. "Truth is subversive only to those who live by illusion." The captain pursed his lips, sizing up the engineer like evaluating an enemy. "You're an intelligent man, Keller. You know there are ideas that must not circulate in wartime." Otto in the shadows watched it all. Bitter satisfaction etched on his face. He saw in Hans a traitor, not a technician. Hans took a step forward and opened the Jeep's hood. "Excuse me, Captain. Look at this." He pointed to the colored inscriptions, the standardized screws, the simple gearbox. "This vehicle speaks to whoever uses it. A soldier can understand it without a manual, without instruction. That's what the Americans understood. The battlefield isn't a luxury workshop, it's an improvised hell." Vogel observed in silence, then said, "And you think we should copy the enemy?" Hans replied, "No, we should learn from him." The captain gathered the notes and ended the conversation. "Your official report will remain archived. The other never existed." He left the tent without looking back. Hans stood motionless, the sound of boots echoing until it faded. Fritz approached and asked, "Do you regret it?" Hans replied, looking at the Jeep, "Regret is the luxury of those who haven't discovered the truth." Outside, a dry wind raised sand and silence. The war continued, blind, while reason slept under an American hood. Night fell heavily over the desert, bringing a cold that cracked lips and made metal snap. Inside the tent, only a lantern illuminated the open pages of Hans' notebook. He wrote slowly, as if fearing to record too much. Fritz slept in a corner, and the distant sound of artillery seemed a constant reminder of the world outside. Each snap of the wind reminded that time was short, and that silence could be more dangerous than any bomb.
Hans reviewed his notes. Total interchangeability, easy engine disassembly, payload capacity 540 kilograms, monthly production 30,000 units. He wrote these numbers like a prayer, each datum an argument against German vanity. The pencil trembled in his hand. "They produce in mass, we in pride," he murmured. At the back of the tent, the Jeep gleamed under the flickering light, as if listening. The engineer realized that, in essence, that machine didn't belong to a nation, it belonged to the future. Just before midnight, Fritz woke and approached. "Herr Keller, do you still believe someone will read the truth?" Hans smiled crookedly. "Maybe not today, maybe not on this side of the world, but truth is like the sound of an engine. When it works, it echoes." The young man nodded, taking the notebook and stowing it in a toolbox. "Then let it stay hidden until someone has the courage to start it." Hans extinguished the lantern, and silence swallowed the tent. Outside, the desert slept under a sky of sharp stars.
Planes crossed the distant horizon, sparks of light in the absolute dark. Hans observed the Jeep one last time before lying down. He thought of what the numbers didn't measure, the silent intelligence of simplicity. "When excess dies, truth is born," he murmured. In the diary, he scribbled the night's last line: "The enemy won on paper before winning on the field." The wind carried the words, but the meaning remained. The early morning of September 18th brought a suspicious quiet to the camp. The sky was overcast, and the wind carried the smell of a distant storm. Hans and Fritz worked in silence inside the tent, illuminated only by a lantern hooked to a peg. Before them, the Jeep rested ready for another test, this one clandestine. Hans wanted more than measurements. He wanted to prove, with facts, that the American machine could conquer any terrain. The war had forced them to act in the shadows, like the very enemies they admired. The first test began before dawn. Fritz timed it with a wrist chronometer while Hans drove the Jeep through the dunes. The 4x4 climbed the slopes without hesitation, the engine roaring low and steady. The leaf springs withstood the impacts with almost animal resilience. The sand parted, the vehicle advanced, and the engine sound seemed a patient breath. Tire pressure, 20 psi. Maximum torque, 11.5 kilograms F at 2,000 RPM, Fritz noted, his voice firm despite the wind. They returned 2 hours later, covered in sand and exhaustion. Hans turned off the engine and listened to the silence. The Jeep hadn't failed once. No overheating, no leaks. Fritz cracked a restrained smile. "Herr Keller, this isn't a machine, it's a trained animal." Hans nodded. "And our pride, a poorly adjusted brake." He knew those notes would never be officially accepted, but they had the weight of truth. American engineering had created something stronger than steel, confidence in improvisation. Back in the tent, Hans wrote a complete report on yellowed sheets, describing the vehicle's performance and durability. At the end, he drew the route map and wrote in firm letters, "Conclusion: this design is the future of mechanized warfare." Fritz watched him and asked, "Are you sending this to Berlin?" Hans replied without hesitation, "No, I'll keep it for whoever wants to understand the difference between building to win and building to last." Outside, the desert roared under the approaching thunder. The next morning, the sound of hurried footsteps cut the silence. Otto Reinhardt burst into the tent, face red with fury, the clandestine report in hand. "I found this in your cabinet, Keller. Care to explain?" Hans raised his gaze, calm. "It's just the truth, written in metal and dust." Otto threw the sheets on the table, scattering sand. "You've betrayed your homeland by praising the enemy." Fritz tried to intervene, but Otto silenced him with a gesture. The air grew thick, and the distant sound of planes resounded like an omen.
Hans approached slowly, hands still greasy. "Betrayal would be lying to preserve the error, Otto. The Jeep is superior, not because it's American, but because it's logical." Otto advanced, finger pointing. "Logical? We don't fight for logic, we fight for honor." Hans kept his tone serene. "Honor doesn't pull a stuck vehicle." The silence that followed was cutting. Otto stepped back, as if the phrase had struck him. Fritz watched, fear in the eyes of one who knew that confrontation wouldn't end well. In minutes, Otto went to Captain Vogel and filed a complaint. Hans Keller, sympathizer of enemy ideas. The engineer was summoned to command, his face impenetrable before the accusations. "My only crime was thinking with my hands," he replied. The captain looked at him long before saying, "There are things the Reich doesn't forgive, Keller, especially reason." The words fell like a sentence. Hans was informed he would be transferred to the Eastern Front the next day. Back in the tent, Fritz awaited him in silence. Hans handed him the true report and said, "Keep this. One day someone will need to remember." Fritz nodded, eyes teary. Outside, engines roared, preparing for departure. The Jeep was still there, firm and silent, its worn paint gleaming under the afternoon sun. Hans ran his hand over the hood and murmured, "You don't belong to anyone. You belong to the truth." Then he walked toward the transport truck while the wind swept the desert and carried away the sound of the American engine. Night covered the camp with a dense electric silence. Fritz Adler, alone in the tent, spread out on the table the papers Hans had entrusted him to. The sound of the typewriter mixed with the distant hum of generators, creating a symphony of tension. Each keystroke was a calculated risk. Copying the report meant challenging the Army's own censorship. "If they catch us, it's the end," he murmured. The wind beat against the canvas, as if the desert whispered warnings. Fritz finished the last page at 2 in the morning. He folded the papers and hid them inside a toolbox marked with the Wehrmacht emblem. The next dawn, he headed to the supply truck where a Swiss messenger waited discreetly. "Take this to Zurich. It's just a maintenance manual," he said firmly. The man nodded, no questions asked, and vanished among the dunes. Fritz breathed deeply. For the first time, the desert seemed smaller before courage. Back in the workshop, Otto had already noticed the missing documents. He called Fritz, who feigned ignorance. "Do you know something?" the old mechanic asked, eyes narrowed in suspicion. "Nothing more than what everyone has seen, Herr Reinhardt, a machine that doesn't lie." Otto watched him in silence and left without reply. Fritz returned to work, hands trembling on the Jeep's steering wheel. He knew the truth was on its way, crossing borders with the weight of conscience. Hours later, the convoy departed, carrying Hans to the Eastern Front. Fritz watched the truck disappear on the horizon and felt something tighten in his chest. Sand rose in whirlwinds, covering tire tracks like erasing history. The Jeep stood still, solitary, the sunlight reflecting on its cracked windshield. "You don't belong to anyone. You belong to the truth." Fritz murmured, and in that instant, he understood what Hans meant. When truth is denied, it finds another way to roll. 3 days later, senior officers arrived at the camp for an inspection. The air was heavy, the wind brought thin clouds of sand, and an atmosphere of tension hung over everyone. Otto saw it as a chance to redeem himself in the command's eyes. He ordered the captured Jeep presented as a technical curiosity, hoping to ridicule the American machine before the superiors. Fritz tried to warn him, but Otto ignored him. Today, Keller will be forgotten. The irony was that, unknowingly, he was preparing the opposite.
The test began under the officers' watchful eyes. The Kübelwagen went first, light, elegant, and limited. In the soft sand, it sank to the axles in less than a minute. Otto ordered more power, but the engine groaned and died. Then the Jeep was positioned. Fritz took the wheel, hand steady and heart racing. He shifted into low, accelerated gently, and the 4x4 advanced as if the desert were a road. The officers exchanged glances, surprised. The enemy moved with the confidence the Reich lacked. The Jeep completed the route in silence, the engine pulsing steady. One officer noted something in his notebook, another shook his head in disbelief. Otto, in the background, sweated coldly. Fritz got out of the vehicle and wiped his face. "Gentlemen, there's no magic, just manufacturing logic," he said calmly. No one replied. The desert spoke louder. The demonstration, meant to humiliate, became a public lesson. A murmur grew among the soldiers. The enemy knows how to manufacture better. The seed was planted. By late afternoon, Otto avoided glances. Captain Vogel approached and said quietly, "Truth doesn't need reports, Reinhardt. It shows itself." The old mechanic said nothing. Fritz looked at the Jeep parked under the setting sun and felt a mix of victory and sadness. The American vehicle, symbol of pragmatism, had defeated not just a machine, but a belief. The silence that followed was almost sacred, and the desert, for the first time, seemed to bow before simplicity. The military train departed at dawn, its sharp whistle cutting the cold of the improvised station. Hans Keller traveled in silence, uniform rumpled, hands stained with grease and resignation. Through the dusty windows, the desert gave way to devastated fields, then to bare, gray forests. The destination was the Eastern Front, where cold killed more than bullets. Inside the car, soldiers slept with rifles in their laps. Hans, awake, thought of engines, not enemies. "War isn't won by who shoots, but by who repairs fastest," he murmured. Arriving at the Russian front, he was assigned to a repair unit in Smolensk. The workshop was a frozen shelter, smelling of smoke and burned oil.
Broken tractors, frozen trucks, and immobilized tanks piled up like iron corpses. Hans worked in silence, fingers numb, body exhausted. At night, he slept over tools and memories. Sometimes he dreamed of the Jeep and woke with the feeling that that small engine still roared for him somewhere. It was his liveliest memory of what common sense could be. One day, during a repair on a Panzer IV, he heard a sergeant shout, "We need to move the vehicle now." The tank, heavy and stuck in the snow, refused to budge. Hans watched thoughtfully and suggested, "Remove weight, downshift, and pull slowly." The soldier laughed. "This isn't an American Jeep." Hans simply replied, "Exactly. And that's why it won't work." The tank remained immobile, and the silence that followed was more bitter than defeat. The engineer felt the weight of irony. The enemy had won, even in absence. That night, alone, he wrote on a piece of yellowed paper, "While we sought perfection, they sought the possible. And the possible led them to victory." He tucked the note inside his coat, next to his heart. The cold intensified, but the inner fire of regret burned stronger. In that war of ice and vanity, Hans already knew he wouldn't return the same. The man that had left as a defender of German engineering returned a prisoner of American truth. Simplicity had exiled him within himself. April 1945. The Reich was crumbling, the sound of distant bombings mixed with the echo of hasty marches and voices of surrender. Hans Keller, now a prisoner of war, watched smoke rise from what had once been Berlin. Around him, hungry and exhausted soldiers awaited transport to Allied camps. The engineer remained silent, gazing at a horizon that no longer had flags. In that silence, he thought not of weapons but of factories. The enemy had won not on the battlefield, but on the assembly lines.
Months later, in a prisoner camp in England, Hans was interrogated by an American major. "You studied the Willys Jeep, didn't you?" the officer asked, curious. Hans nodded, voice hoarse. "It was the vehicle that taught the world that winning is manufacturing." The major smiled. "And you tried to improve too much." Hans replied simply, "We tried to be gods. You tried to be human." The American fell silent, impressed by the lucidity of that defeated man. The war had ended, but the lesson lived on, pulsing like an engine in idle. Back in Germany, he found a nation in ruins, destroyed factories, burned cities, men and ideas fragmented. Even so, amid the wreckage, something new began to emerge. Hans worked on industrial reconstructions, applying principles that had once condemned him: standardization, modularity, simple maintenance. "Producing well is producing much," he told his new apprentices. The spirit of efficiency had survived, now purified by defeat. The Jeep, though distant, guided his philosophy like a luminous shadow. In 1949, Hans walked along a newly inaugurated assembly line in Wolfsburg. He watched a small automobile being assembled, light, simple, accessible. He smiled and murmured, "Simplicity won." In the notebook he always carried, he wrote his last annotation: "The triumph of reason is the triumph of humility." In the background, the rhythmic sound of tools recalled heartbeats. For Hans Keller, the echo of victory didn't come from tanks or cannons, but from the serene rumble of engines any man could repair. Spring 1955. The sun rose over the factories of Lower Saxony, and the air smelled of new iron, fresh paint, and hope. The metallic sound of presses had replaced the roar of bombers, and where destruction once rose, production now pulsed. Hans Keller, gray-haired and serene-eyed, walked the factory floor at Volkswagen, watching young mechanics assemble cars that recalled an old dream: simple, robust, for everyone. The sound of engines in testing reminded him of the Go Devil, that small American heart that had taught him the value of logic over pride. Each new automobile rolled off the assembly line with millimeter precision and popular soul. The design was clean, the engine accessible, the parts standardized, a manifesto that Germany had learned. "Less refinement, more intelligence," Hans told the apprentices. The country was reborn, not by ostentation, but by practical efficiency. And in every workshop, in every maintenance manual, echoed the benevolent ghost of a Willys Jeep, the enemy turned teacher. Defeat had become doctrine, and doctrine, progress. In the office, on Hans's desk, rested an old photograph, him, young, beside the captured Jeep in Tobruk. The edges yellowed, but the shine still alive in the eyes of the man who had discovered the truth behind simplicity. His son, Carl, also an engineer, entered the room with a project in hand. "Dad, the new model will be exported to America," he said with a smile. Hans looked at the blueprint and replied, "Then finally they'll learn something from us and we from them." The cycle completed with serenity. That afternoon, before leaving the factory, Hans stopped before the assembly line and listened to the coordinated sound of tools. The metallic echo seemed the same as the deserts, now transformed into a melody of reconstruction. He smiled and murmured, "What fire destroyed, reason rebuilt." As he left, a light wind blew through the windows, like the breath of time bringing reconciliation. And as the sun set over reborn Germany, a final phrase hung invisible in the air. The most enduring victory is that of those who learn from defeat.